I'm Mike Farrington. Welcome back to my shop, aka the boardroom. So in this video I'm going to be demonstrating my method for quote-unquote hand-cut dovetails. And I've been meaning to put this video out since I constructed this moccasin vise that you see displayed here. And if you're interested in its construction, have a look at my channel and you'll find a build video. And before we get started, I would like to just make mention of the fact that these are technically not hand-cut dovetails, although in appearance they look exactly like hand-cut dovetails, except maybe a little bit better. And finally, my method really is a combination of methods that I've found over the years. And what makes this system unique is I think I've boiled it down to the best part of each of the different methods that I've studied. Alright, so we get started by collecting all of the appropriate tools. And I'll offer more information about each of these tools as the video progresses. So I don't think it's possible to attempt hand-cut dovetails without first learning how to sharpen. And I know that there's a ton of information out there on how to sharpen, but if there's enough demand, I'll put together a video on my version of sharpening, and if you want to see that, let me know in the comments section. I built this moccasin vise a little while back specifically to help with dovetailing. And one of the key features is that the front jaw, or the jaw that's closest to my hands, sits 1/8 of an inch lower than the rear jaw, or the one that's being clamped to the bench here. And this ensures that there's no interference between the workbench and the piece that's being clamped in the moccasin vise. Next, I milled up a couple of scrap pieces, made sure that they were nice and square. And I think it's important to have two marking gauges. A lot of times when you're doing dovetails, you'll need to be able to mark two different thicknesses. And these are just cheapy round marking gauges, nothing special here. I have a few different nicer marking gauges, and I find myself drawn to these. If you're new to this, I suggest making your marking lines nice and deep. It'll help in a variety of ways as you move through the process. I will normally mark very shallow because I don't like the line to show after I cut the dovetail. I like to be able to plane it away easily. A cold shop and hot coffee. What could be better? To make sure clamping pressure is even, I like to calibrate one side and then calibrate the other side, and then the vise is ready to clamp your workpiece. Marking for dovetails could be an entire video unto itself, but my philosophy when laying out dovetails is if I'm going to take the time to have a hand-cut dovetail, I want it to be decorative. So I would never lay out even dovetails. I always would want to do something to call attention to the fact that I've put so much work into this joint. With that said, my design style is fairly subtle, so I don't get too carried away. Alright, here's cheat number one. This is a Veritas dovetail jig. And there are a few different versions of this style jig on the market, and I've also seen a few interesting shop-made versions. But what I like about this one is that it has a clamp. I feel the key benefit to using a jig like this is consistency. I don't think there's anything more frustrating than getting most of the way through dovetailing a drawer or a case piece and then screwing up one dovetail and having to scrap that workpiece and start over. I find that with a jig like this, the mistakes are fewer and further between. Alright, here's cheat number two, and that is I just either use a dot or a line for layout, which saves quite a bit of time versus traditional dovetail layout. So this saw is made by a Japanese company called Gaikucho, and it's model number 410. And these saws could be the best bang for your buck in the industry. I think the saw is under $40, and if the blade ever dulls or gets damaged, the replacement blades are under $20. The exact saw you use doesn't really matter. I just prefer a saw that doesn't have a spine. If your saw does have a spine on it, it will limit your depth of cut. One final thing to note regarding the saw that you select, you might want to end up buying two, and you would want one with more teeth per inch and one with fewer teeth per inch. And the reason for this is that the saws that have a high tooth count per inch will be very slow cutting in thicker material. And that's part of the reason it's cutting slow here in this shot. This saw is good to about 1/2 inch thick material, and then I would choose a saw with fewer teeth per inch for anything thicker than 1/2. Rather than cutting on the other side of the jig, I just prefer to turn the piece around, and one little helpful tip is to skew the piece so you're cutting in a vertical fashion. When lining up to make the second tail cut, I just prefer to set the jig up so that the saw falls back into the original saw curve. And this creates a very narrow pin, which in my opinion is the mark of good craftsmanship. So you want to make sure to precisely saw down to your line, and this will make the cleanup between the tails much easier. So if this method is seeming a little slow to you, I typically will work a little bit faster when I'm not filming. And I think that any speed lost in using the jig and moving it and setting it up, I think is gained in consistency. And to me, I would rather work a little bit slower and a little bit more consistent with fewer mistakes. This saw is either known as a fret saw or a jeweler's saw. And I prefer to use one of these over a traditional coping saw because the little itty bitty skinny blade fits down nicely into the thin kerf of the pole saw. So when doing this, the idea is you want to saw as close to your line as you're comfortable, but you'll still have to come back and clean up with a chisel. This chisel was too hot. This chisel was too cold. And this chisel was just right. So if you're going to be cutting a lot of dovetails, especially ones with small pins, you're going to need a couple of small chisels. And I find for this work a 1/4 inch and a 1/8 inch chisel both do wonders. If you decide to give this method a shot, I think you'll find that cleaning the waste out between the tails is the most time-consuming part. And this is compounded by the fact that the space between the tails is very narrow. But of course, if it was easy, everybody'd be doing it. Alright, so when doing this, definitely don't drop the chisel right into your marked line right away. What you want to do is kind of rough out the excess material until there's maybe a 64th of an inch, maybe 32nd of an inch left to the line, and then you want to drop the chisel on the line to do your final cutting. So these little half pin cuts, you can either saw right up to that line or do like I do, and that's just chisel up to it. Here's another great feature of the design of my Moxon vise, and that is the little shelf hanging off the back. It makes for a good place to clamp your workpiece, but also a little desk lamp like this one. And when doing precise pairing work like this, having a good lighting source really makes the job easier. And if you're not comfortable pairing at the Moxon vise, I find this position to be a comfortable way to pair as well. And you can kind of use your thumb as a little depth stop, and it's nice to get in and scrape out little extra bits of wood. Alright, so now you've cleaned out all the waste between your tails, it's time to mark for the pins. Many moons ago, a buddy of mine gave me this Veritas marking knife, but the blade of it is very thick, and my solution was to take an old Bosch jigsaw blade and grind it into a nice thin marking knife. Back over to the vise, we load our pin board for marking. And really the key to marking is two things. One, you want to be able to register the two parts to each other accurately. And two, you don't want them to move when you're marking. So I created this stop that I clamped down to the vise. It butts up against the pin board, and then the tail board butts up against it. So once the tail board is butted up against the stop that I just clamped down, I slide the tail board so that the marked line that you've paired down to just touches the edge of the pin board. Once everything's clamped in place, I carefully mark, and I usually take 2 or 3 swipes on each mark to make sure that the line is deep enough to be able to see clearly. And I like to press the back of the marking knife up against the side of the tail, and this just helps more accurately mark. And here's the result. So what I didn't tell you earlier was that this jig is actually a transformer, but I'm not sure if it's an Autobot or a Decepticon. Here I'm changing it from tail mode to pin mode. If you're wondering why I've been wearing gloves with the fingers cut out of them, well, here's the answer. I recommend never adding pencil to a marked line. I've just done it here for clarity while on camera. I do recommend marking out the waist areas though. If you're new to cutting dovetails, this is probably where you're going to make a mistake. It's critical that you saw to the correct side of your marked line. So here I'm just slightly tapping the jig over so that the outer edge of the saw blade just touches the marked line. And again, if this seems a little bit slow, after moving the jig and positioning it several times, you get pretty good at knowing what the kerf of your saw is, and setup becomes pretty quick. So here's cheat number 3, or whatever number we're on. When you're sawing the pins, you don't have to saw all the way down to your marked line because of the router that gets brought in later to do the clean out. This will make more sense in a few minutes. Just saw close to the line. I'll leave it at that. And here I've switched over to the pin cuts that go the other direction. And here I've switched to a different saw made by Gaikucho. It's a Ryoba style saw, which means it has teeth on both sides. And if you're going to buy just one saw, this is a pretty good way to go because it has coarse teeth on one side and fine teeth on the other. And I should have been using this saw the whole time because it is much faster cutting, but I couldn't remember where I put it. But at some point during the day I remember that I last used it in my basement, so I went and got it and switched over. And next I switched over to a coping saw, and I'm just roughing out the waist between the pins. And I switched from the fret saw to the coping saw for this operation because it's faster cutting than the fret saw, and when doing these cuts you're kind of cutting a further distance, so a little bit extra speed helps. Next is the final clean out between the pins, and then after that it's on to assembly. And this operation really is my favorite part of this method for 2 reasons. One is it gives you very good results, and 2, it's very fast. So it's important to put quite a bit of care into making sure that all 3 of those surfaces are level, the pin board and the 2 jaws of the Moxon vise. Follow that up by setting the depth of your router to cut just down to your marked line. And if you look carefully there, I'm using what's called a pattern bit, or a router bit with a bearing at the top of the cutter. So this allows you to press the bearing up against the side of the pin and you'll get a nice flush cut all the way down to your marked line. So here's the reason for the 2 rabbits in the top of the Moxon vise jaws, and that is it creates a little bit of clearance to move the router around. I own a truckload of routers, but these little mini DeWalt routers are my favorite. They feel well built, and I like the light that lights up the bit area. So here's the finished product, and as you can see, it just perfectly routes the waist out between the pins. But you can also see the area between a few of the pins that's more narrow, that the router bit diameter was a little too big to get into. And there are a few solutions to this problem, and the first of which is just make sure your layout is such that the router bit can fit in between all of the pins. Or the second would be to choose a router bit that's narrow enough to fit between the smallest opening of the pins. And just as a side note, Amana does make some really small diameter template bits, as well as a few other top bearing bits that could be useful in this operation. And of course, chisel and mallet works as well. And if you choose to use a smaller diameter bit that isn't bearing guided at the top, you just have to be careful when you're routing up near the saw kerfs. But with a little bit of patience, you can route right up to your kerf and get the exact same results. Tiny bit of pairing between those narrow pin spaces. Here it is, the test fit. One other neat feature of this vise design is I put leather on one of the jaws, and that provides enough grip so that you could hammer on your workpieces and they don't slip. So for smaller workpieces, here's how I take them apart. This obviously wouldn't work for case side or something like that, but for drawer parts it works perfect. Well, we've come this far, we might as well glue it together, right? So cutting dovetails, whether you fully cut them by hand or if you use a method like this, it takes practice, and I recommend you get out to your shop and pick up some scrap and go to town. See what you can come up with. You can play around with design, try different techniques, and you'll constantly improve, and that's a good thing. Cleaning up dovetails is best done with a hand plane. So when I mark for my pins and tails, I usually mark them so that they're a little bit long, and that leaves the ends proud here, and they need to be flushed up with a hand plane. And that offset is easily adjusted by changing the setting on your marking gauge. And different situations call for different amounts of offset. If you want your dovetails to be proud, you're going to want a larger offset. If you are dovetailing a drawer front that's already been fitted to an opening in a case piece, you want 0 offset. So here it is, glued together, flushed up, and looking purty. So if you're thinking about using this method, and I suggest you do because it's awesome, let me know how it turns out. Maybe send me a picture or write a comment. I'd appreciate the feedback. Finish it out with a few pictures of some projects where I've employed this method. If you liked this video, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, let me know. I'd welcome the feedback. Till next time, thanks for watching.